In the name of our one loving and life-giving God. Please be seated. Earlier this month, I spent a week in London as part of a seminary class studying how the Church of England Diocese of London has been revitalizing existing congregations and forming new congregations for the previously unchurched. We met with persons in leadership roles in the diocese and visited London churches representing the wide spectrum that is Anglicanism today. This included, for example, Holy Trinity Brompton, better known today simply as HTB, where there were no prayer books or bulletins, and whose regular services are like those typical of non-denominational evangelical churches in this country. A solid half hour of praise music by a band with electric guitar, keyboard, drums, and vocalists, where one song just blends seamlessly into the next, followed by a sermon by a casually dressed pastor, supported by multimedia displays on big screens, ending with something like an altar call, accompanied by another session of praise music. For contrast, we also visited St. Eth's, a revitalized congregation in Fulham, which identifies as Anglo-Catholic, with, priests that vest, and hymns, and a prayer book liturgy, and yes, a Eucharist. In other words, just what I assumed I would find at a Sunday service in a Church of England parish church. Except there were dogs. Not packs of them, but enough to notice and more than I expected. And they were not necessarily sitting politely in a pew, but at least one felt perfectly at home enough to be meandering in a side aisle where the little children were playing. One of the ushers even brought a dog down the aisle with her as she passed the collection plate at the offertory. Over time and across places, ideas have of course varied about who or what is welcome where. HTB and St. Eth's are places of broad welcome, apparently including at St. Eth's even your dog. Jesus, for his part, was welcomed most places he went, but not everywhere. And in today's gospel reading, we meet a woman who wasn't welcome anywhere until she encounters Jesus. First, let's set the scene. In the gospel reading last week, an exhausted Jesus sleeps in a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee. A storm arises, his disciples wake him, he calms the storm with an awesome display of power, and they arrive safely at the other side. In a part that the lectionary skips over, we learn that where they land is Gentile territory. There, Jesus quickly overstays his welcome. He causes a bit of commotion involving demons and a herd of swine, and the locals ask him to leave. In today's reading, he and his disciples now cross back over the sea, returning to Jewish territory, where crowds gather to welcome him. Jairus, a leader of the synagogue, is especially grateful to see him. He falls down before Jesus and begs him to lay his hands on his daughter who is dying. So they set out for Jairus' house, with crowds still pressing in on him. And among them, there is a woman who has been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She has spent all her money on doctors, but to no avail. Having heard about Jesus, she is convinced that if she but touches his cloak, she will be made well. It is difficult for us to appreciate the desperation this woman must have felt. 12 years of any sort of chronic condition is an extraordinary hardship, but this was much more than that. Besides the physical manifestations, the discomfort and presumably some pain, The disease had also bled her of all her money. But worse than the poverty and disease were the social implications. Illness was associated with divine punishment, so her persistent affliction implied great shame. And because her illness involved a discharge of blood, under Jewish purity laws, she was ritually unclean. Anyone she touched or who touched her would have been rendered ritually unclean as well. This was true of menstruating women generally, but normally that's a temporary thing. But since this woman's hemorrhages persisted, she never stopped being considered unclean, and there was nothing she could do about it. She lived in a state of perpetual impurity, isolation, and exclusion. There was no place where she would be welcome. Jesus was her last resort. In seeking Jesus' assistance, she broke the rules. Given her condition, she had no right pushing through the crowd and thereby risk infecting others with her uncleanliness. But she had no other option, and it succeeds. She manages to touch Jesus' cloak and immediately is healed of the bleeding. Presumably, she would then have wanted to slip away as unnoticed as she had arrived. But Jesus will not have that. He feels the surge of healing power leaving his body and stops to find out who received it. Our bulletin cover shows one artist's depiction of the scene at or just before the moment of touching. See how, knowing her lowly place, the woman hovers down at ground level, one hand on the street to balance herself as she stretches to reach Jesus. Now, notice the guy standing at the far right with the ornate yellow headpiece, looking down at her, perhaps with a hint of disdain, because her outstretched foot may be touching the base of his fancy garment just as she is straining to touch Jesus. I'm thinking that guy is Jairus. And imagine his reaction when Jesus stops. What, he must have thought. My daughter is dying and he stops for this? And then, once the culprit identifies herself, someone plainly of no account, especially in comparison to Jairus, Jesus lingers in order to engage with her. Time's a-wasting, but Jesus stays long enough to hear her story. And not the Reader's Digest version. No, he waits as she tells everyone the whole truth. A truth that confirms that this woman was someone unclean who had no business even being there in the first place. How could this delay be justified when Jairus' daughter lay dying? And indeed, from the initial look of things, this diversion appears to have cost Jairus' daughter her life. While Jesus is still speaking with the woman in the crowd, word comes that Jairus' daughter has died. Maybe if Jesus had not stopped, he would have gotten there in time, but no. Was this hemorrhaging woman worth that? Well, for Jesus, yeah, it was. And as we know, it wasn't a matter of choosing between the two. Jesus is quick to assure Jairus, do not fear, only believe. The restoration of the woman in the crowd did not mean that Jairus' daughter would not live. Once Jesus gets there, he brings her back to life. Both are saved. And that's because God's realm is one of abundance, not scarcity. It isn't as if there isn't enough Jesus to go around. In God's economy, the hemorrhaging woman and Jairus' daughter are not in competition with one another. Both can live. But it is even much more than that. it is not just that healing the woman did not prevent Jesus from saving Jairus' daughter. No, as several scholars have argued, their stories are interconnected in a way that the healing of the latter should be seen as dependent upon the healing of the first. That is why Mark combines their stories, embedding one in the other. Let me explain. Having told us that the woman in the crowd had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, Mark makes a point of letting us know that Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. So the two have this tie. The woman has been suffering as long as the daughter has been alive. But it is not merely that coincidence that matters. The number of years is significant. 12 is a number signifying wholeness and completeness in the Bible. It is the number of Jesus' apostles, and of particular relevance to this story, the number of tribes of Israel. These women are meant to represent two ends of the social spectrum comprising Israel. A daughter of privilege with a leader of the synagogue as her spokesperson, and a suffering outcast with no one to speak for her. Their stories are tied because at the end of the day, there can be no wholeness for the daughter of privilege until the outcast is restored to wholeness as well. Jesus' mission is a holistic one. He has the wellness of the whole community in mind. As Lutheran scholar Paul Nuchterlein says, Jesus came not simply to bring healing to isolated individuals like the two daughters in this wraparound story. He came to heal the system which makes the families of human communities outsiders to one another, declaring some to be unclean and untouchable. He came to help us see that there never will be any ultimate healing and peace until we cease to play the games of insiders and outsiders. That is why Jesus had to stop to engage with the woman in the crowd. It wasn't to cure her illness. By the time he stops, the woman had already been cured of the bleeding disorder. The hemorrhage had stopped, and as Mark tells us, she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. But Jesus' work does not end there, for she still had not recovered what her designation as unclean had taken from her, a sense of belonging. Cured or not, Jesus knows that what he has to do before moving on is to connect with her as a person and in turn to restore her to community. For so many years, this woman's illness had been her identity. But with one word, Jesus restores her to the only true identity God meant her to have. Daughter, he says, welcoming her back to family. He then bids her to go in peace. Only then, with that accomplished, could he properly attend to the synagogue leader's daughter. Far too many people have, like the woman in the crowd, known the sting of rejection by a religious establishment telling them by word or action or both that they are not welcome as they are, or made to feel that they are somehow unworthy because of who they are. That is not Jesus' way, and thank God it is not ours. In a few minutes, we will have the chance, all of us, to touch more than Jesus' cloak, but to come together as one in the feast of Jesus' life-giving body and blood, where all of us are known and loved. And to this, everyone is welcome. No outcasts, no exceptions. Renewed and refreshed, our work will not end there. I think we do pretty well here at Christ Church, making everyone present feel welcome. But when we leave, our focus rightfully turns to the people who are not here with us today. Perhaps we know someone who needs to be reassured that regardless what others may have led them to believe, they too are beloved children of God and who, with our invitation, can find that affirmation here. But more than that, whenever and wherever we are, when we encounter someone who has been cast out or made to feel that they do not belong, on whatever basis, disability, sexual orientation, previous marital status, race, gender identity, social status, whatever, Jesus, in today's gospel reading, models for us an approach that we, with God's help, can imitate. Stop and take time to connect with them. Hear their story. Welcome them as family and bid them peace. If enough of us can do that, then we all will be made well. Amen.